So, video game scoring systems. If you don't know what they are, you're either an old person, or you have been living under a rock since you were born, or both. Since pretty much the beginning of the rise of video games, scoring systems have been a staple as to tell if you are doing good or not. They can also up the competitive factor if you are in a multiplayer situation. Rhythm games are a good example of keeping score in some manner. Another form of this usually used by such games is the percentage, usually to show accuracy. And surprise, surprise, vib-ribbon has a score system as well. How does it utilize the score? Well, if you didn't know what the game was, you would think it would be a pretty straightforward answer. But is it really? Ha! How oblivious! This game's scoring system's pretty convoluted. The scoring system in vib-ribbon is quite different than in most games. Well, those with the scoring system, of course. This scoring system can be seen in two ways throughout the game. The first way being the number of points you got in that specific stage straight up. Okay, cool. But where do we see this? At the end of the stage. Of course! The other way the game displays the number of points the player got is a lot more interesting. Get this. What it does is bring up a specific set of shapes that spin around in a circular formation located on the top of the player's screen. These shapes get more majestic as the player gets more points. Now, how much more creative can that get? Okay, so that leaves one more question though. Why? Well, it's likely more of a design choice if you ask me, but it's more than that. Once you know it, there's quite a bit of math behind this concept. I am not sure how boring this will turn out to be, but I do know how it's done. So let's show it off, shall we? During the course of the song we are playing, we find that the familiar base 10 numbers are not used, because simplicity can't be applied everywhere, right? Instead, we are introduced to something that can be treated as Vibry's way of counting. Or is that just me who thinks that? Okay. As you might have guessed from seeing at least one screenshot of the game, you may have noticed there are multiple shapes used to show the amount of points the player has gotten in shape form. A question that may come into your mind may be along the lines of, is the number calculated from the shapes that are displayed, or are the shapes generated from the number that is displayed after completing the stage? To answer this question, we need to dive into some addresses in the RAM during gameplay. In other words, we're going nerd mode. If you know your score at the current time, preferably at the end of the level, but just before you are taken to the results screen, you can easily find the RAM address that keeps the score while it's being counted up. For RAM address manipulation, I'm going to use this free PlayStation emulator called DuckStation, which I totally recommend. It is pretty optimized and can run PS1 games many times faster than on a real console for most computers. The thing that has me most interested is that it is open source, among other things. But I digress. This way, we can easily find where this RAM address is using our trusty memory scanner. We can just find out where this collection of shapes represents in number form and... Oh, we don't know how to do that quite yet, do we? First, we should get ourselves familiar with what the shapes are. Another term coined up by fans of the game for those who wish to be more fancy. You could also call them score coupons. Seriously, the wiki says so. Am I going to buy a shape half off with those? We will go over them one by one and determine how many points you'll need to acquire it. First, we have this little blue line. The line starts appearing when the score count reads 0. Here's a fun fact. The game will also always go to a game over screen when the stage is completed with 0 points. The little blue line can be used as an empty space for no points added at the end of the sequence of shapes as well. Second, we have this 3-line shape that will always be equal to 1 point. Always, of course. As you might have guessed, these shapes start appearing when the player receives at least 1 point or more. Shocker. As you also might have guessed, 1 point is the minimum requirement to win a stage in vib-ribbon. After this point, we will have to know that these next shapes are a bit more complex to understand than aforementioned line and 3-line. This starts appearing with this plus shape, which unlike the last two shapes, can be able to represent 7 different numbers. We'll go into why that is in a little bit. The plus shape can be achieved when the player obtains at least 8 points. Well, there isn't too much to mention about the rest, so we'll just go through them rapid fire. Otherwise, it would just take too long. Next up are the bolded line, which starts appearing when the score reads 36 points. The bolded 3-line starts appearing when the player reaches 120 points, the bolded plus shape with 330, the triangle with 792, the diamond with 1716, the pentagon with 3432, the hourglass with 6435, the 3 triangle with 11440, the 4 triangle with 19,448, the 5-point star with 31,824, the 6-point star with 50,388, and finally, the heptagram with 77,520. Whew, but why such random numbers? Hang on to your seats, have this full chart for now. Again, all of the shapes past the 3 line can all have 7 different values depending on the state of the score. But why is this the case? Well, get ready to feast your eyes on Pascal's Triangle! Wait, what the hell is Pascal's Triangle? Who's ready for your 2 favorite subjects? I know I sure am, at least. It's time for history and mathematics. The modern versions of Pascal's Triangle was written by French mathematician Blaise Pascal, which was published after his death in 1665, where it was originally called the
Traité du triangle arithmétique.
He was not the first to think of such a concept because it was used in China as far back as over 700 years ago, as Yang Hui's triangle. Before Pascal, it was described by some Persian guy in the 13th century in his literature works. Hell, even its concept was first developed as a procedure by a Hindu poet named Pangala in 200 BC, in which it was described again by some other guy named Varahamihara several hundred years later using Pangala's procedure. Damn! So yeah, it was pretty well known before Pascal gave it the universal name. That's actually kind of surprising. Who knew so many people had that much free time on their hands, especially enough to essentially invent the same thing? Before we take a look at what vib-ribbon does with Pascal's Triangle, what even is this thing? In case you have no idea what it is, or you don't pay attention to math outside of school, let's build our own Pascal's Triangle from scratch. First, we put a 1 at the top of the triangle, and then add 2 more 1s below it like this. At this point, we could start adding things together. Once again, in the 3rd row, we can add 2 more 1s to the sides, and then add the 2 1s on the 2nd row, giving us a 2. 3rd row done, now on to the 4th. We put the 1s to the sides, and then add 1 and 2 together to get 3, 2 and 1 to get 3. 4th row done. 5th row, put 1s to the sides, 1 plus 3 equals 4, 3 plus 3 equals 6, and 3 plus 1 equals 4. Done with the 5th row, we keep going with this process for every line necessary, and eventually, we have something like this. Reminder that someone spent time on this. Kudos. We've been talking about math for so long that you probably forgot that we were talking about vib-ribbon scoring system. Bear with me, bear with me. If you take a closer look at this chart, you may notice some of the numbers that I've mentioned before. You're still paying attention? Good. Now watch as I add lines like so that we can reveal that all of the numbers within this range relate to the ones on the table I showed you. And over here, we can assign each of these lines to one of the shapes from the set. We can also make another set of lines that cross with the other set of lines to get the other variable, which defines the place of which the shape resides in, labeled 1 through 7. Now we're going to places with this, so you can pat yourself on the back for we have an even more majestic visualization than this one. Do you know what that also means? We can manually translate shape scores into base 10 instead of having it be done automatically. Awesome! This part is actually kind of simple. Just keep in mind that the only numbers in the triangle that matter are the ones in this range. All of these rows can be only used once, and they need to be the shapes in order from highest rank to lowest rank. That's why we labeled them, so no picking them randomly. You will get it wrong if you don't follow the order. Okay, now we have the simple guidelines in mind, so now let's start adding these values together. To start, focus on one of these numbers here, whichever one is correlated to your first and largest valued shape. Anything below this row becomes unimportant to the specific shape square equation because of this. For the second slot, look at the shape slot's corresponding row and find the shape that fits it. Same goes for the 3rd row, the 4th row, and so on until the 7th row, where you can call that your final piece for your equation. From there, it is a very simple process if you know what you learned in 2nd grade. So you just gotta do some extreme addition with all 7 values. And presto! There's your shape score as a base 10 value. Okay, back to finding out what this number is. So let's just insert the shapes into Pascal's triangle and then add them together. It's 727. We got 727 from this example string. Yay! When we search for this value, it can take a little bit of looking around depending on what number it is, but eventually we can see that in our case, it is located here under 0x00060800. Now that we have access to what the score will be at the end of the stage, we can basically make the score whatever we want. Changing this value and unpausing the game will update the shapes accordingly. Since during gameplay, the game is constantly checking this value to make sure to change the shapes based on the address's value. Sounds familiar? That's because it is a question that we have asked before. What we have explained just now proves that the shapes are generated by the specific RAM address. But it is not as simple as it is at first glance. This is why we should dive a little deeper. It is common knowledge that the Queen or super form of vib-ribbon can bring you more points than the rest of her forms. We can prove how this is true, and in the process, we can also demonstrate how the other forms gain streaks. For every form except for the Queen, it starts with adding 1, then 2, then 3, 4, 5, and so on, up until vib-ribbon evolves into her next form, capping at 11 points for every successful obstacle. With a big asterisk. These may vary. That can be proven because I ran multiple trials. There are 2 factors as to why it varies so much. One of these are due to freestyling, or the act of pressing extra buttons in between obstacles, leading you to grab even more points. Accuracy is also put into play here, although it is not as effective as freestyling. It can allow to skip a few of the steps leading up to that 11-point bliss. This streak, as it should, is not cleared when vib-ribbon changes form, and is only cleared, obviously, when the player misses his obstacle. vib-ribbon's Queen form is the form you can snatch the most points with. Upon evolving from a rabbit to a queen, if you kept your 11 points every time streak, it suddenly becomes 22 points every time, assuming you don't freestyle. So this is why if you want the most points in a stage possible, you're best off staying as a queen for as long as you can without making a single mistake while pressing as many buttons in between obstacles as needed. High scores are no doubt one of my favorite things to accomplish within vib-ribbon. I just adore the song that plays when it happens. Like seriously, just look how cute it is! Did you know that there exists a certain threshold where you can still activate the congratulatory song without achieving a new high score? Yeah, that's how much the song can vary. This threshold exists when the player reaches at least 2,000 points in the bronze course and the silver course, as well as 1,500 in the gold course for some reason, 2,500 in the single track course, and finally 20,000 in the all tracks course. But anyways, back to high scores. High scores are only checked once a new one has been reached and is added to the top 3 leaderboards for that stage. So after the congratulatory song ends, you are able to screw up the values in there as well. You could even make them all say 0 or even negative numbers if you wanted to. Why would you want to do this? I don't know. Bonus points are thankfully more simple than all of what I've said so far, so let's just get it over with. Basically, all it does is take the value of your shape score and divide it by a certain number. How is this divisor determined? It depends on what form vib-ribbon was in after completing the final obstacle of the course. So that means we can receive a different amount of bonus points when we complete the stage in vib-ribbon's Queen form, rather than her frog form. Luckily for us, these numbers are easy to find out. If you're table of the game, then there's a new crazy thing called the internet, and we can find them by just watching some vib-ribbon gameplays and looking for the clear screens at the end of these stages. But I'd rather just play the stage myself. During each clear screen, a helpful equation on the side is formed, showing both the shape score from previously, and also the amount of bonus points we got. Here, I have an example of a completed stage I just did, aka edited the hex values to make it look like I did. All we gotta do is take the shape score and divide it by the amount of bonus points, and ta-da! We have our divisor. As you can see, it's not going to be accurate every time, so if you wanted to narrow it down, just play the stage again. But do you really need to? It's called rounding. To wrap this up, when we complete a stage as vib-ribbon's rabbit form, then our divisor is 5. Then the answer is rounded down. To go through the rest of these, the frog form's divisor is 6.666 repeating, wait for it, round it down, and then the worm form has no divisor and always sets the bonus score to 0. Round it down. If you know one thing about the inner workings of RAM in pretty much any computer, especially with video game consoles in our case, such as the original PlayStation, you may be familiar with a cool thing called RAM addresses, which store values along every byte of RAM, used for the thing you are trying to do. In the PlayStation 1's case at least, which is a 32-bit system, They can rely on bytes, half words, and words. Words are the one we'll be focusing on mainly, which can range from negative 2,147,483,648 all the way up to 2,147,483,647. Try saying that 5 times fast. If we already know where the score is stored before it goes through the final calculation, where do we copy that number to in order to calculate that final score in the first place? We can rule out everything else in the system because, unsurprisingly, this all takes place in the RAM of the PlayStation 1, since the entire game, after progressing past the game's title screen, is loaded onto the RAM. It does that because it's gotta make its selling point work. If we remember from earlier in the video, you may remember the RAM address 0x00060800, which we will just call the hex score from now on, for simplicity's sake, but also because it sounds cool. And you may also remember that the game is constantly updating the shapes according to the hex score's value. This is not the value's only use, however, as it is also used for the final calculation of the score. The value from the hex score is taken to 2 other values for the addition of both that and the output of the bonus equation to create the final score. Both of these addresses are shown here. We have 0x00076394, which we will just call the level score, and then 0x00076398, which we'll just call bonus point. What happens is that upon clearing the level, the frame that the clear screen begins, the hex score is cleared and then is copied over to both the level score and the bonus points. Except the bonus points have to, again, check what form vib-ribbon was in at the end of the stage, and then divide accordingly. Lastly, the level score and the bonus points are, quite obviously, added together to get our final score. Nice. Now that we know what RAM addresses we can screw around with, let's abuse them. Before we can break the limits of the score in vib-ribbon, we first have to mention the limits themselves, which there are quite a few of. This is where the true fun begins. First off, as you might have seen before, there are 15 shapes programmed into the game, so inevitably, there will be a limit as to the number of points that can be achieved with just shape points alone, ignoring the limits of programming as well. Using Pascal's triangle once again, and filling in all of the slots with the heptagram shapes, we can see that it all adds up to 116,279 points. This would explain why the level score will always cap at this number, no exceptions. So there is our maximum number of points without bonus points. 116,279 points. Keywords, without bonus points. That's because even though the shapes cannot progress any further than 7 heptagrams, the game is still counting points because of the hex points. But these hex points, if hex points in the PlayStation 1's RAM are stored as a word, does that mean we can get the final score to be 2,147,483,647? Well, unfortunately, we are unable to do that, because the value of the bonus points overflows long before that. In case you want some background on that, here's what happens during an overflow. As with pretty much all computers, the storage, RAM, BIOS, and almost everything inside of them, it's comprised of bytes, which are made out of 8 bits. Each byte can represent a number, and the number it represents is that byte's value. The values of a single byte can range from 0 to 255. If you try to add 1 to 255, if you wish to fit it in 1 byte, it will overflow to 0, because the binary digits in that byte cannot fill in for a 9th bit. Ha! How silly! That would require another byte entirely. Similarly, the value can also underflow to a positive number. But then, how does vib-ribbon keep track of large numbers such as 2.1 billion? That is because some of the RAM addresses account for a group of bytes. And this is where we would introduce the 2 familiar types for it that we have mentioned before. A word is made out of 4 bytes, or 32 bits. And while we're at it, a half word is made out of 2 bytes, or 16 bits. As a result, this 2 billion limit fits well into the word category. There's multiple terms for these things though, as it's dependent of its environment. Like I wanted to call them byte shorts, ints, and longs, but that's Java, not the PlayStation! Note that there is one catch to the types of values though. No matter how many bits make up the value, there will always be a limit as to where the number will overflow, leading to a negative number instead. Larger types of words delay the inevitable, Since vib-ribbon uses words for the scoring system, which once again are 32-bit values, the others mentioned will not be very important to the specific topic. So if it stores 32-bit numbers, then why is it that whenever I screw around with a value, why does it overflow so long before that 2 billion number?
What?
It took a while to find out what it meant, but I do have an answer for that. Remember how the final score relies on a divided number? Yeah, since the bonus points have to be rounded down, it needs to be more accurate, so 2 of the numbers are reserved as decimal places, so they are cut off from the value. That should wrap up the introductory bits. That will serve as our segue to... There are unintended states in vib-ribbon that casual players are not meant to reach. Minor aspects of the game can begin to behave incorrectly, and that includes going far past the shape limit of 116,279, especially when the player reaches the millions. Like for example, setting the hex score to 10 million, and then completing the stage. In this case, that leaves with 2,116,279 points. And this can lead to interesting results. Nailed it! I tried a few more values, but can only seem to get values between 2.1 million and 2.2 million to do the exact same thing up until 2.4 million and beyond. My best guess is that numbers this high are never intended to be said, so when they are said, the game pulls up unintended sounds. Numbers of 2.4 million and above will do this. Did we just softlock ourselves? Don't be so quick to assume things. You could just press the cross button to skip it. After this point, the game does not know what to do with how Vibri should say the number at all, so it kind of just stops before it can even attempt it. It's part of the magic of breaking video games. At this point, our last step of going up is finding the maximum possible score in the entirety of vib-ribbon. Remember that the RAM address for bonus points overflows when it is over 1% of the signed 32-bit integer limit. So in order to get the bonus score to be 21,474,836, we first have to figure out the values for the hex score in order to achieve this. This is an easy problem to solve because we can just multiply the bonus points by the correct divisor. So after this, we get a score of a whopping 21,591,115 points. Can we go above this number? Unfortunately, no, we can't. I tried it any way I could. This is it. This is as high as we can get it. Should we go past this point, the number automatically becomes negative, and we'll loop back around, back to 21,591,115. It can do this several times throughout the 2.1 billion positive values we put in, and can be done in any form of vibri except for the worm. It's like a cycle. In case you're curious, it happens 3 times with the rabbit form. Now, negative numbers is where it gets real. They are like the strange cousin to really high positive numbers in vib-ribbon's scoring system, except it's a little stranger. Because for one thing, the lowest lows of scores of vib-ribbon are much farther from 0 than the highest highs. So that means, even though it's impossible to get 2.1 billion points even by manually modifying the hex score, we can get negative 2.1 billion points, and somehow it does not underflow back into the positives. One thing of note is that anything below a hex score of 0 will result in the shape formation at the top of the screen to still display as 0 regardless. And the craziest part is that the division problem is still intact in the negatives, and the game can put the values together just fine. Oh wait, that's not right. It seems that, as the value goes under negative 107,374,182, the division seems to function incorrectly, but this time, this could actually be due to some type of underflow. This number may be familiar to you, as it is the polar opposite of another number that has to do with the maximum possible score in the game. Below this point, along with the math being all wrong, it will creep closer and closer to the minimum signed 32-bit integer limit. But wait, there is more! You may have noticed some weird anomalies with the numbers that are displayed here. Now, as you can see, with the majority of negative numbers, these don't look right at all. No, trust me. These, in fact, are negative numbers. But really, what does this even mean? 44,499 multiplied by the Star of David. Of course, as you might expect, the game is never supposed to work with negative numbers, so what happens is that it starts to display some of the symbols that are also loaded into the game and use those as numbers. This counts for the seconds and even the shapes themselves. Another weird detail is that vib-ribbon can also say these numbers incorrectly as well, sometimes saying a very small number, sometimes skipping the numbers entirely, or even menu navigation sounds. These non-existent numbers truly are too dangerous to be kept alive. This and the jumbled messes of symbols are by far my favorite part of this whole topic, and it just comes to show the ways we can break vib-ribbon. It doesn't stop there with the score, because I have a few more little miscellaneous tidbits to mention. One of these has to do with the auto mode feature, where you can sit through a perfect run without any user input. If we observe the hex score while we play a stage in auto mode, it's still counting up and we don't need to put any effort into it. Perhaps the hex score is counted up when it is in a stage at all, rather than checking what mode it is in. So, as a result, it's still counted up, even in auto mode. A proof for that claim is how the exact same thing can be observed in speed mode, another mode where the score is disregarded the entire time. Another thing that I have noticed with the score is that these RAM addresses differ between different regions of the game's release, which is to be expected for all video games for the era. The values I have mentioned were located in the PAL release of the game. For vib-ribbon's Japanese release, the score is kept in a slightly different location in the RAM. We can also conclude that pretty much all of the aspects of vib-ribbon are different in the Japanese release when compared to the European one on the RAM front. Another thing that I have noticed while experimenting is that since players were not intended to get millions of points during normal gameplay, only 6 digits for each number are displayed in the equation and the congratulatory song, not counting what we see in the dialogue. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, lots of useless technical information, sure, but we pretty much went over everything there needs to be known about vib-ribbon's scoring system in detail. We went over what the shapes are and how they are added. We also went over the details of the streaks and why it can vary, the high scores, and even the bonus points added at the end of the stage and how we can use it to break the game. Final words. I'd say it was kind of fun looking at all of the different quirks vib-ribbon had to offer from just a variable set of numbers. This is part of what introduced me into the technical side of vib-ribbon. I guess with finishing the script and eventually the video itself, I can finally put this topic to rest. Since this was a lot to uncover, I'm also surprised as to how long I rambled about this for. Now, how long did I go on for? Almost 30 minutes? Anyways, I also want to thank C Circus 445 and ILC for providing some of the information, since we were all screwing around with this topic around the same time. If it weren't for them, I would have a less accurate and more lackluster video than what I have in the end. And lastly, I want to thank you for watching. Let me know what you think of my explanation, since this is the first time I finished a video like this, and constructive feedback is appreciated. Until next time, bye.